Alright everyone, in today's lesson, I'm actually going to go through geographical investigation skills, understanding the tools of the geographer. So in this lesson, we will be going through what is GI, what are the different methods of carrying out GI, as well as what questions related to GI will require from you. Alright. So, what are geographical investigations, or in short, GI? Basically, geographers are interested in finding the answers to different issues such as impacts of flooding, such as whether housing is inclusive. For them to do so, they need to carry out investigations. You need evidence. Therefore, geographers carry out geographical investigations. Alright, so at this point, what you should already know is firstly, the different types of data, primary versus secondary. So primary data is data that you go out to collect yourself. For example, you go out and you carry out a survey. That is a primary data. Secondary data is data that has been collected by someone else and then you use it for your research. For example, a newspaper article that was written by someone else. That is a form of secondary data that you can use for your research. Next, you also need to know about the different ways to gather primary data and their methods. So this involves knowing what to do and what to avoid. So we need to know when we are trying to find data, what must we do properly and what must we make sure that we do not do so that we get the accurate data for our research. So the different ways to gather primary data is, for example, using photographs, field sketches, surveys, and interviews. So each of these methods has their good points and their bad points, as well as how to do them properly in order to avoid collecting data that cannot be used. Alright, so when we're talking about questions in GI or questions in the exam which tests you about GI, you will be given a scenario where you must judge someone's choice of method or to suggest a hypothesis based on the data given. So for example, they will tell you a story about a group of people who carried out a GI using a particular method. So based on that story, you are supposed to tell us what was wrong about the method that they chose, how could they have improved their research, and secondly, based on the data that they collected, suggest a hypothesis or suggest something that they found out from their research. Alright, this means that you need to be familiar with the do's and don'ts of each method. You need to know what to do as well as what to avoid for each method, as well as what counts as reliable data, because reliable data is data that can be used. Unreliable data is inaccurate data and therefore should be avoided. Alright, let's take a look at some sample questions, right? These are the questions that you will encounter perhaps in your examinations. Alright, so the questions may sound like this. So for example, give a reason why the data may be biased. This asks you to investigate their methods. Secondly, should you accept or reject a hypothesis? Suggest two ways in which data collection method can be improved. So from these questions, what you guys should understand is that you are supposed to give suggestions or critique the way in which people did their research and provide suggestions on how they can improve the GI that they have done. Alright, let's take a look at this question over here, okay? So students from the Flooding Academy wanted to carry out a geographical investigation about the impacts of flooding. After discussing among each other, they hypothesized that flooding leads to social impacts such as emotional distress. To find out if their hypothesis should be accepted or rejected, they decided to carry out a survey with 3 flood victims from a nearby town. Figure 1 shows their survey questions as well as the results that they have collected from their fieldwork. So this is an example of a story that you might see in your examinations. So over here you have information about what they did, how many people they interviewed or surveyed, as well as the hypothesis that they have. Alright, so the questions that these students asked in their survey is, firstly, were you injured in the flooding event? This will be a yes or no question. Did you lose a loved one in the flooding event? Again, a yes or no question. Do you experience any emotional distress because of the floods? This is also a yes or no question. So since the hypothesis is whether flooding leads to social impacts such as emotional distress. The third question will be very important for rejecting or accepting their hypothesis. Alright, so this is the results of the survey that they were able to capture. So for question 1, were you injured in a flooding event? Only one person said yes and that they were injured. For question number 2, none of them lost a loved one. Question number 3, all of them said that no, they did not experience emotional distress as a result of the flood. Do note that they only interviewed 3 people. So do you think that this information is accurate for us to come to a conclusion? Alright, so based on this data that the students have collected, you need to answer questions related to the fieldwork results and research methods. Basically, they will ask you questions about whether the GI methods were accurate, etc., etc. Alright, so based on the hypothesis collected, should they reject or accept the hypothesis that flooding results in social impacts such as emotional distress? Let's look at the results, alright? So if we look at the results over here, question 3, which is relevant to the hypothesis, none of the people who were surveyed said that they experienced emotional distress. Therefore, does it agree or disagree with the hypothesis? Take 5 seconds to think. Firstly, do you know what a hypothesis is? Basically, a hypothesis is a testable prediction. Before we carry out a research, we should have a prediction of what we want to find out. So a hypothesis is basically something that guides our research. So we do a research to accept or reject a hypothesis. So based on the results in question 3, did you experience emotional distress as a result of the flood? None of the people who were surveyed said yes. Therefore, we have to reject the hypothesis because the results that we gathered did not support the hypothesis or the guess or the prediction that we had about the impacts of flooding. Alright, so just take 5 seconds to internalize this information. At any point of time, if you feel that you do not understand anything, please feel free to rewind a couple of seconds back or to just rewatch a particular section and move on when you're ready, or when you're ready and you fully understood the section that you had problems with. Alright, moving on. So the second question is as such: give a reason why the data may be unreliable. So for this question, it requires you to investigate the fieldwork process. So for what I mean by fieldwork process refers to, for example, how many people they interviewed, how they chose the people who they interviewed. So these refers to the fieldwork process. Alright, so some of you may not be familiar with this on what makes data unreliable. So unreliable data refers to data that is biased, okay, meaning that it is unfair. So it is caused by a sample that is not representative. So representative the meaning of representative means that it reflects the population. Don't worry if you are unsure about what this term means. We will go through it in a bit. Alright, so let's take a look at a sample GI question that these students have. So the question is, the hypothesis that they had was Singaporeans love char kway teow. And then when they were selecting the people to interview, they decided that let's ask only our Chinese classmates. So along comes their friend, and then they ask their friend, do you love char kway teow? And this friend then goes on and say, yes, I love char kway teow. And then the two students on your left decided that, yes, we are right. Our hypothesis is definitely right. Singaporeans do love char kway teow. However, their friend on the right is saying, are you sure I represent the whole population of Singaporeans? So does interviewing one Chinese classmate equates to interviewing the general population of Singapore? What do you guys think? Also, their friend raises another question. How did you select who you interviewed? Is it just based on who you saw? Or was the selection process more random where everyone had a chance to be selected to be interviewed? So these are the things that we need to think about. Alright, so let's talk about a sample now. In the earlier parts of the video, I explained about representativeness of a sample. So basically, let's take a look at these two circles here, right? So a population refers to the whole group of people that you are trying to get an idea of. So let's say there are 6 million people in a country. Do you think you can interview all 6 million people? The answer is no. It's just too many people and you do not have the time or the resources to interview them. Therefore, we need to pick a smaller group of people which represents this whole group of people in order to interview, in hopes that this small group represents the general feelings or sentiments that are felt by the whole population. So some of the things that we need to keep in mind is probably things such as race, age, gender, socioeconomic status, whether they are rich, whether they are poor, what class do they belong to. So these are the things that you need to think about when you are selecting a sample size. In the earlier example, they only decided to interview Chinese classmates. So what about Singaporeans who are Malay? What about Singaporeans who are Indian? What about Singaporeans from other races? Their thoughts and comments are not collected. Alright, so data can be unreliable when your sample population does not represent the people you're trying to study. So in the previous example, the students were trying to study about Singaporeans, but they only interviewed their Chinese classmates. So it does not represent the whole population. And secondly, when your sample selection is unfair. So for example, when your sample selection is too small, you interview too little people, or only going to people that you know. For example, only selecting people who sit around you in class instead of giving everyone an equal chance to give you comments about your hypothesis. For those of you who are interested in finding out more about geographical investigation methods as well as best practices, these are the pages that you can look at in your secondary 2 textbook. Alright. So, back to the question. Give a reason why the data may be unreliable. The students from Flooding Academy interviewed only 3 flood victims. Is this problematic? The answer is yes. Therefore, the data is unreliable because the sample size was too small, only 3 people, and not representative of all flood victims. So they only interviewed 3 flood victims and were trying to make a about all flood victims. Alright, so in the story, what you guys actually get is that one of the classmates was actually trying to suggest that they should do interviews instead. So this is a 6-step process of interviews. It is the 6 things that you need to remember when you are carrying out interviews. So firstly, you need to greet the respondents and introduce yourself. Secondly, state the purpose of the interview. For example, hi sir, we are carrying out an interview to find out whether Tampines neighborhood is inclusive. This will only take around 5 minutes of your time. Alright, so then check whether the respondent is willing. If the person says yes, then you can go ahead with the interview. If the person says no, just say thank you and remain polite. So assure him or her that the survey responses are confidential. You have to make sure that you do not leak the results or their identity to people around, to your friends or to other people. Fourth, be polite and jot down the responses. Just nod, smile, and make sure that you remain polite. Fifth, ask questions to clarify your doubts. Do not assume that what you think your interviewee is saying is what they are actually feeling. For example, let's say you ask, what do you like? And and then the person says, I like food, and then you go on to write in your interview questionnaire, this person liked apples. So the person said nothing about apples, but you are assuming that the person is saying something about apples. Do not do this. Ask questions if you are not sure. And lastly, thank the respondents after completing the interview. Alright, so the last question for this video is, in relation to their conduct and behavior, what must the students keep in mind when conducting interviews? So in this question, we have to talk about the interview etiquettes, meaning what must we do when we are carrying out interviews. So while you are carrying out the interview, you must ensure that you are polite and respectful throughout the interview. Let's say a person rejects you when you ask them whether they are willing to be interviewed. Do not go on and grumble and say, or give this sound. These are things that you should avoid. Always smile, be polite throughout the interview process. So that is the end of my video. I hope that you've learned something about geographical investigations and that you will do well for your examinations. Thank you and have a good day ahead.